Yeah, the outbreak states and the non-outbreak states, that's what we're getting to, isn't it? So we've seen all this kerfuffle about the Doherty modelling, which underpins the 70 and 80% targets for freedom, part of which arose from my interview with Jodie McVernon, the Director of Epidemiology in the Institute, on Sunday Agenda, where she made it clear if New South Wales entered an 80% vaccination rate with thousands of cases, it would require a different model.
So I think it's important to differentiate between what our report is discussing, which is making a transition from a state of no or very few cases into a more immunised environment, and then thinking about how transmission might be managed there, as opposed to coming down off a high caseload. So clearly vaccination is going to be a critical tool to augment the public health response in New South Wales, but our report doesn't specifically address that case.
Is what is set out in your report not appropriate if New South Wales is, say, at 1,000 or 2,000 cases a day by mid-October when we get to 80%?
Clearly, we're working with New South Wales Health and with colleagues based at the University of New South Wales who are specifically addressing how vaccination can support New South Wales' current response, and these pieces of work are closely aligned, but that wasn't really what our roadmap was set up to address.
So the day before this interview, Scott Morrison's departmental head, Phil Gaetjens, in the face of Premier's comments on the matter as well, sought a reassurance that we could still open up at an 80% vaccination rate with hundreds of cases in New South Wales from Jodie McVernon, and got that assurance. The federal government hope is the New South Wales curve bends. Scott Morrison wanting to push here that we have to open up at 80%, however, no matter what.
So, Look, I think there's some hesitation based on the fact that there's been more cases that have occurred in New South Wales, but as the Doherty Institute made clear again yesterday, that doesn't ultimately have an impact on the conclusion of their modelling. What it does mean is, as you just heard in the intro, your previous person you're interviewing, of course you've got to get things right in your public hospitals and your health system, and that's the work we need to do. We should just be preparing for that, walking into the plan, not walking back from it, because Australians are doing the right thing. And 7, 8 out of 10 Australians who have done the right thing and got vaccinated, well, the plan was a deal for them. It wasn't a deal with me, it was a deal with them.
So I'm aware the government is in possession of focus group research which shows, certainly in New South Wales and Victoria, strong support for this plan, and also a suggestion in other states that there is growing support for it. For coming out at that 70 to 80% rate. So perhaps no surprise why the government was effectively campaigning for it in question time. When pressed on what it will mean for state borders and the rest, however, the PM says we'll see in terms of what happens. Perhaps with one eye to next year's election, he doesn't seem to want to force the issue with Queensland and WA. The vaccination rates are very disappointing in Queensland and WA. Of course, there is no outbreak there to convince people, but hesitancy still a concern. In Blacktown in Western Sydney, where there is an outbreak, they are racing to get vaccinated in the face of the virus. It is the most improved location in the country, going from 53.6% first dose coverage a week ago to 64.8% now. 11% jump, pretty extraordinary. And GPs and pharmacies are doing the heavy lifting there. Scott Morrison spoke about what good work the pharmacists were doing on vaccinations in question time.
More than half of Australians aged over 16 have had their first dose of the vaccine. Yeah. Mr Speaker, more than half. That's 1 and 2, Mr Speaker. 6 million doses of that vaccine now have been delivered in New South Wales, Mr Speaker. 2/3 of those have been delivered by the magnificent GPs and pharmacists who are doing this all around the country. Mr Speaker, there are more points of presence where you can get the vaccine in Australia today than you can get a Big Mac, Mr Speaker.